spirit of prophecy emphasis, I am constrained to take a minute to express the administration's appreciation for the quality of service that Dr. Yorke has exercised as director for the E.G. White Center. He has brought a life and energy to the center which sets the pace for anyone that would follow him. Unfortunately, someone will be following him soon because he leaves at the end of December because of family situations. That's the best word I can find at this point. But Dr. Yorke, we're going to miss you. And we're going to miss the service you have provided to this campus. About 3 weeks ago, I had the privilege of watching 3ABN. And I saw a program in which the early church and its pioneers were being uplifted and revived and brought back to memory. It was engaging. The speaker exercised a sense of humor that was soft and congenial. And so I spent the entire time watching the program. Not to, at that time, be aware that 3 weeks or so later, I would be shaking his hand in my office. James Nix, director for the Ellen White Estate at the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, is our speaker this morning. And as I listened to him talk about the pioneers, my spirit was buoyed up, excited again. And I asked him, did he know a gentleman, Pastor Van Polen, who operated in the Inter-American Division for some years. And the reason I asked the question is because both men had something in common, how they talked about the early pioneers. You're forced to be engaged. And so we are privileged to have Pastor Nix with us this morning. He started working at Loma Linda Research Center in 1976 and continued there until 1993. Between 93 and 95, he was Associate Director of the E.G. White Estate General Conference. 1995 to 2000, he was Vice Director of the estate. 2000 to present, he is the Director. Ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged to have him speak with us this morning and bring us the message. His wife, Mindy, is a trained school teacher and presently works at the Spencerville Academy, Adventist Academy. He has a daughter and one grandson. I can assure you, you're going to get a message that will revive your spirit. God bless you. Just before he speaks, the NCU Ensemble will present the next item, after which you'll hear Dr. Nix, Pastor Nix.
absolute favorite hymn, and I don't think I have ever heard it sung more beautifully. Thank you for blessing. I could go home right now. I have been blessed. Thank you. But it does clinch what I decided to do. I should not tell you this, but when I did the series for 3ABN a couple of weeks ago, I never thought about the fact that 3ABN, I know it, but I never thought about 3ABN. It's shown all around the world. And so I was one day home between trips, and I knew I had to throw some notes into my briefcase to come here, and I threw the ones in from what I gave on 3ABN. And then, wouldn't you know, I was in Dr. Gardner's office, and he said, I saw you on 3ABN. I don't know which you saw, but I don't dare give any of those talks again down here at NCU. So we're going to do something entirely different. And then this morning I thought of something else, but I couldn't get it to all work with the technical side. So I want to just do something for the students. It's not a sermon, but I want to begin with a story. In fact, that's what I'm going to tell you, some stories about Ellen White. The Sabbath school program this morning was outstanding by the Spirit of Prophecy Club, and you learned a lot from them if you didn't know already about Ellen White. Pastor Wellington's presentation was outstanding also. So you've already had a Bible study and you've had some anecdotes. Let me just talk about Ellen White for a few minutes as a person. And I want to start with a story that plays off of this hymn. When I was in college many years ago, I had the privilege of meeting several of Ellen White's grandchildren. And one of them was her oldest granddaughter, Ella White Robinson. Mrs. Robinson was 33 when Ellen White died in 1915. So the math majors at least will be able to figure out when she was born. The rest of us may not, but at least the math majors can. Anyway, I was talking with her one time and I said, Mrs. Robinson, of all of your recollections of your grandmother, what is your absolute favorite memory? And without even pausing, she just got a smile on her face and she said, oh, that's easy. She said, grandmother was preaching one Sabbath. She was wearing a loose-fitting black sack dress. You've all seen pictures of Ellen White, so you know what kind of a dress that Ella was describing that her grandmother was wearing that Sabbath as she was preaching. And she said people were listening as grandmother was preaching about the matchless love of Jesus for each one of us. And then she said, right in the middle of her sermon, grandmother paused. She stopped. She said it was almost as if the congregation wasn't out there in front of her. And she looked up as if she were looking into the very face of Jesus. And she said, oh, Jesus, how I love you, how I love you, how I love you. If you think about the words of the hymn we just heard, I don't know how else but what we could say the same. Oh, Jesus, how we all love you. We love you, we love you for what you did for us. Ellen White was a sensitive person. We don't usually think about that. I think she was basically a shy person most of her life. So it was not easy for her to be the Lord's messenger and to give some of the messages that she was given. Why do I say I think she was shy? Well, if you know anything about Mrs. White's life, you know that when she was just a young girl, she was a Methodist before she became a Millerite Adventist, and then a Sabbath-keeping Adventist. But even as a Methodist, she wanted to have enough courage. She was so shy she could not pray in the prayer meetings, but she wanted to pray out loud in the prayer meetings. But she couldn't bring herself to it. I don't think she ever got over that basic sense of shyness. I'll tell you a story from the other end of her life that illustrates to me at least, that Mrs. White was always shy. This happened not too many years before she died. She was living at her Elms Haven home in Northern California. It's down at the bottom of the mountain. You took a little windy road. It's still a windy road up to Pacific Union College, but not as windy as the old road was. She would go up the night before if they'd asked her to speak for chapel. She would go up by horse and buggy usually the night before. She would spend the night in the girls' dorm. The next morning she would speak for chapel, and then she would stay for lunch, and then after the lunch she would come back down. Now she didn't drive by this age. She was not driving the horse and buggy. Somebody else would drive it for her. But when she came to lunch, after she had spoken for chapel, she came into the dining room, and just like any politician or any famous person or anything else, everybody stopped. And they looked over at Mrs. White. Now, if you're shy, the last thing you want is everybody to look at you. But they're all looking over there to see what in the world. And so she comes in with her son and her secretary and a couple of people, and they get seated, and everybody's trying to look to see, you know, what is she eating? What is she doing? Some things haven't changed after this, you know. Adventism. What do we eat? What do we mix this with that and all that? Anyway, so everybody's over there looking. Now, there was one thing that Ellen White liked to have with her meals, and that was greens. These could be salad greens, they could be tender mustard shoots, they could be dandelion greens, whatever happened to be in season. She liked greens, and for whatever reason, they were not serving any greens this particular day there in the dining room. So Ellen White had this lady that had lived and worked with her for so many years. Her name was Miss Sarah McInterfer. Now, Miss McInterfer was one of these kind of take-charge people. You probably met that kind of personality. There is no problem too big that can't be solved if you have a Miss McInterfer personality. And so Miss McInterfer is looking, and she sees that Ellen White, there's no greens, and she knows that Mother, she lived with her so long, she called her Mother, though she wasn't related to her physically, but she called her Mother. She knew that Mother didn't have any greens. There was none there being served today, and so if you're the take-charge type, what do? You have to solve the problem, right? So, marched herself back into the kitchen area, and before long, she came out bearing triumphantly a bowl of greens. Right there in front of all these people that are, straining and stretching and trying to see what's going on over there. And when Ellen White saw what Miss McInterfer was up to, she said to her, "Really, Sarah, I could have done without my greens on this one occasion." And Sarah, who must have had a deep voice because the people that imitated her voice to me always lowered it a notch, she responded, "There's no need to deprive yourself, Mother." And with that, Ellen White had her greens. Now, I tell you that because when we look, as I just said a minute ago, at some of the things God invited Ellen White, or asked Ellen White to do, not invited, He assigned her to do, it was not easy for her to carry out those messages. I could just say another word about Sarah McInterfer. She really was the take-charge type person. She ran Ellen White's house. If any of you have ever been to California and you've been to Elmshaven, you'll know what I'm going to describe next. When you come up on the front porch, you come right into a little hallway, and straight ahead is a little museum room today. That's on the first floor, and then Ellen White's bedroom is upstairs on the second floor. Her writing room is up on the second floor. But it's that museum room today. That was Miss McInterfer's bedroom. And believe you me, if you did not have an appointment to see Ellen White, you did not get upstairs to her writing room. Miss McInterfer took her work very seriously. And there were crazy people sometimes that showed up that wanted to see Ellen White, or people had some hobby horse that they wanted to try to get her to endorse. And Miss McInterfer just sent them all packing. She also would send the grandchildren packing. Now, if there's one thing that grandmothers like, it's what? See their grandchildren. And if there's one thing that grandchildren like, it's what? See their grandmother. But Miss McInterfer, doing her duty, she would say, "Now run along, children. You know your grandmother's very busy. Go run along, run along, run along." Now, it's interesting. I talked to several of the grandchildren, and they all told me how much they loved her, but then I wondered, because of some of the stories they told about her. But anyway, she'd send them along. Now, one of the grandchildren, or two of them actually, told me that they had discovered, again, if you've ever been to Elmshaven, you'll know what I'm going to describe. There is a back door to the house. And there is a little narrow stairway that winds around and opens right into Ellen White's writing room on the second floor. So guess what? When the grandchildren wanted to see grandmother, they didn't go to the front door where Auntie Sarah was. Where did they go? The back door. And then they would tiptoe quietly upstairs. One of them told me we even knew there was one step, they were wooden steps of course, that would kind of creak, make a noise when we went up, and so we walked on the other side. So we didn't even, Miss McInterfer had no idea. So they would come upstairs, open the door into their grandmother's writing room, and they knew their grandmother was busy. They understood that. They learned very young that her work was very important. But they also had worked out a little arrangement with their grandmother. So when they opened the door and looked into their grandmother's writing room, they would see her across there seated in her writing chair, and she would see them. And when she had finished doing whatever she was doing, writing or whatever, she would lay her pen down, and that was the sign. That was the signal they'd worked out. And they would scamper across the room, climb up on her lap, and she'd give them a big hug and a squeeze, and she might say something like, "There's a heaven to win and a hell to shun." That was one thing they remembered her saying. Another one was, your name is White. You must always keep it that way. But she would tell them about some new chicks that had hatched or whatever was going on, you know. And then they'd be in there 2 or 3 minutes. They would go back downstairs, down that little back stairway, quietly out the back door, and guess who's out there in the front room, totally happy, thinking she's doing her job, not having any idea that Ellen White's had this nice little visit with her grandchildren, Miss McIntyre. That's the way they all worked it out, you know. So anyway, talking about Ellen White's assignments, it was not easy being the Lord's messenger. People watched every move that she made. They criticized her. They criticized her family. They criticized her children. I mean, it was not easy being the Lord's messenger. Yeah, let me just tell you, I'm trying to watch the clock. I was told when to sit down, and I could go on and on when it gets to telling stories instead of a regular sermon. So anyway, let me just tell you one story about the family, because if you ever thought that the White family was totally perfect, they were human. Ellen White was human. Ellen White's children, her boys, were human. Let me tell you a story that was told to me by Ellen White's grandson, Arthur White. He was telling it on his father, W.C. Willie White, son number 3 of James and Ellen White. This was while the Whites were living in Greenville, Michigan. James White had suffered some strokes, and all the pressure of Battle Creek. Ellen White wanted to get him out of there. She wanted to regain his health, and so she moved him up to Greenville, and he went along. Poor Elder White, he didn't quite know what his wife was up to, but anyway, she was quite a character in terms of getting his rehab going. You know, she one time sent her son out to buy some rakes because they needed to bring in the hay, and she brought the hay. Told him he couldn't do that. There was no way. He was so weak and ill. And she said, "Well, I'll tell you what. I'll pitch the hay up on the wagon. Can't you stack it up? You just stand up there and stack it." Well, he had to allow he could do that. He didn't want a woman doing all of the work. So anyway, but it was all part of her rehab plan. Well, while they were living there in Greenville, they didn't have a church school, no Adventist church school. And so son number 3 was attending the public school, and he didn't like his teacher. So one night, he and another schoolmate climbed into the classroom after hours, and Willie wrote a poem on the blackboard, and the poem went like this: "The devil flew east and west, north and south, and caught up Miss Jones in his mouth. But when he saw he had a fool, he dropped her here to teach our school." Now, I don't know how you picture the White family, but this story came from Arthur White, so Willie White's son. So anyway, then he and the other students scampered out of the classroom. And the next morning, when the teacher arrived, she was a better teacher than Willie gave her credit for, because she recognized his handwriting. So never underestimate the professors, you know. So she left the poem right there on the blackboard, and all the students came in and they got seated. Now remember, she knew who wrote it, but she said, "Would the young man or the young lady who wrote this please identify himself or herself?" Now, many things have changed since the 1860s, but a few things have not. There was total silence. Not a word from anybody. So she went over and stood in front of Willie White's desk, and she said in the formal language of that time, "Master White, I know you wrote this. I recognize your handwriting. I want you to take it back. Or in other words, I want you to apologize." Now here's what Arthur White told me his father's response was: "I can't take it back." Now that was bad enough. He probably should have stopped right there. But he didn't. He said, "I can't take it back because my parents have taught me always to tell the truth." You can see what Willie thought of that particular teacher. I said to Elder White, what happened next? And he laughed and he said, "You know, that part of the story's never come down. I don't know." But he said, "I do know what kind of a reputation Grandpa White had." That would be James White. He said, "I do know what kind of reputation Grandpa had, White had, and my guess is they had a session out behind the woodpile." I don't know what your term is down here, but in America that meant he got a whipping. It was not easy being the Lord's messenger, and there was no inside track. Because you were related to Ellen White, it did not give you some inside track to heaven or whatever. One of the saddest things that I've heard from Ellen White's immediate family is I've heard Arthur White, the grandson, say on 2 or 3 different occasions that the only member of Ellen White's immediate family that she did not expect to see in heaven was her twin sister, Elizabeth, because her twin sister had no interest, apparently, in religion whatsoever, as near as we can tell. And so it had to be terribly sad, your own twin. So she prayed for her twins. Well, she prayed for her siblings, but she prayed for her twin sister. She would write to her twin sister. Her twin sister suffered extreme arthritis the last 10 years or so of her life. Ellen White paid one time for her twin sister to go to Battle Creek, to the sanitarium, hoping that the influence would help her sister spiritually and the treatments would help her sister physically. Apparently neither one happened. It was very sad. Ellen White was not able to attend her twin sister's funeral because she died while Ellen White was in Australia. But it was not easy being the Lord's messenger. She had no control over when a vision was given to her, and she had no control over the content of a vision. Speaking about the content of a vision, one of the most difficult assignments that I think I've ever read about Ellen White being asked by God to do, or assigned by God to do, was a message that he gave her on one occasion for a person. She was not told the name of the person. She did not see the person in the vision. She only heard a voice. And it was indicated to her in the message from God that when she heard that voice, she was to deliver a message. But she didn't know who the person was, so there was no way that she could prepare herself. You know, if you're going to deliver a hard message, sometimes, even if you're the prophet, you're human. And so you need to kind of think and pray how to do this. She had no way of doing that because she didn't know when she would hear the voice. One time, not too long afterwards, she and her husband, James, came onto a campground, and they got settled for the campground where they were going to be speaking. And then they made their way over to the main tent where a meeting was in progress. And as they approached the tent, I think her heart must have sunk a little because, in her chest, because she heard the voice. And she knew from experience that she was to do exactly what she had been told to do. And so she seated her husband towards the back of the tent, the way the story has come down to us. She made her way down the center aisle. The tent was set up with seats on each side of a center aisle, like this hall is. And she came right down, and I can imagine, this is not part of the story, but my imagination is, as she's making her way down that center aisle, people are seeing her and saying, what's happening now? Why, there goes Sister White. I wonder, whispering to each other, but she didn't let that deter her at all. She came right down, right below the pulpit, and she looked up at the voice, meaning the man that was preaching. And she said, brother, I have been shown that you have no right standing in that pulpit preaching to this congregation. How many of you would like to have an assignment like that in front of 10 other people? That is it all. She went on to say, I have been shown that you have on this campground a woman that thinks she's your wife, and you have children here who call you father. And then she said, I have been shown that in another state of the United States, you have a woman there that thinks she's your wife, and you have children there who call you father. You have no right standing in that pulpit preaching to this congregation. Now, for those of you that are theology majors, you are taught in homiletics to have a good conclusion to your talk. I presume this brother had a good conclusion, but this was not the one he got to give. The sermon obviously was over. He's out of there. And now Ellen White is left to deal with this startled congregation. And I think, though the story doesn't tell us her reaction, I think she must have breathed a prayer of gratitude for what happened next, because the story does tell us that just after the man left the platform out the side of the tent, another man stood up in the congregation and said, I'm Elder so-and-so's brother, and everything that Sister White just said is true. Several years ago, my brother came to me and confided that he was living a double life. He made me swear that I would tell no one about what she just said is true. As I say, I think, though the story doesn't tell us that, she must have said, thank you, God, for the affirmation. Maybe when you hear incidents like this, you can understand a little bit better something that Ellen White's youngest granddaughter told me one time. She said occasionally, not very often, but occasionally, when her grandmother would come from the bedroom in the morning, she would say to the members of their family, did you hear the angel choir singing last night? And they would say, no, Grandma, we heard no angels last night. But Grace, the granddaughter, said, as we talked amongst ourselves in the family, the conclusion that we came to was that once in a while, again, I got the idea this was not very often, but once in a while, God would send the angelic choir to sing to Ellen White in a prophetic dream of the night, to lift just momentarily the burden that he knew she was bearing by being his messenger. No, it wasn't easy. In fact, in 1880, she wrote to her son about a camp meeting. She said, I had some very bad jobs to perform. I took Brother Bean and wife and talked to them very plain. They did not rise up against it. I cried myself, could not help it. Of course, she knew what it was. There were testimonies that came to her. There were testimonies that God gave her messages for her husband, members of her family. I don't know if you guys have ever thought about possibly being married to a prophet. Now that would be a new wrinkle on things. I mean, if your wife is one that has these lists, you know, honey do this, and honey do that, and honey do the other thing, how would you like to be married to a prophet? Honey, I've been shown that the Lord says you should do this. The Lord says, it just puts out a little different picture on the relationship, doesn't it? And yet, you know, I've read, I think, all of James Nix correspondence, and I've not ever read one place where he says, oh no, not another vision. Now sometimes his actions show that he said, oh no, I have no idea how to carry it out. And it would take him a while to figure out how to do what the Lord had shown his wife he should be doing. But I've never read a place where he said, oh no, not another vision. It's interesting. But it wasn't easy giving messages. In 1874, she wrote to Elder Loughborough, I have felt for years that if I could have my choice and please God as well, I would rather die than have a vision. For every vision places me under great responsibility to bear testimonies of reproof and of warning, which has ever been against my feelings, causing me affliction of soul that is inexpressible. Never have I coveted my position, and yet I dare not resist the Spirit of God and seek an easier position. Well, I'm supposed to sit down in about 3 minutes, and there's so much I can say. Let me just give one story about sense of humor, because some people think she was, you know, a very somber person, and of course she can be serious when it needs to be, but she also had a good sense of humor. Talking to grandchildren, they said she had as good a laugh as anybody else if something funny happened. But let me just tell about one little incident where she used a little humor. Some of you probably have heard this story, but she was preaching one Sabbath, and as she was speaking, she noticed in the congregation people were kind of whispering and pointing, and she couldn't figure out what in the world was going on. And as she was speaking, she happened to glance over her shoulder, and there was her full-grown son, W.C. White, you know, our poet friend from the classroom earlier. He's now an ordained minister. He's sitting on the platform, and he's sound asleep. Now she knows why people are kind of motioning and making little funny faces and stuff, because, you know, mother has put son to sleep with her preaching. And so what did she say now that she knows what's going on? She said, you know, when Willie was a little baby, I had a cradle made, and it had extra wide foot rockers, and as I was preaching, I would stand there with one foot rocking the cradle, and Willie learned to sleep during my sermons. And you can see that he's never gotten over it. And I suppose the congregation reacted just like you did, and I probably woke up Elder White sitting there on the platform. Let me just say one other thing. Sometimes people think that Ellen White's counsel is very extreme. As we learned this morning, you should read everything. Don't just come to some conclusion based on one specific quotation from somewhere. Read and get the balanced picture, because the counsels that God has given our church are very balanced. But sometimes people think that she was very extreme. Let me just give you one example to show how she handled things. Because, you know, if you read the health message, it's not just about vegetarianism. There's all kinds of things: sunlight, washing, you know, keeping your place clean, and exercise, and all this. And so she believed in fresh air. She was, again, preaching on a Sabbath, and when she stood up to preach, it was in the spring, and everybody thought that it was still too cold, and so they had all the windows shut up in the church where she was speaking. And she stood up. She didn't say a thing at all about, have any of you read the counsels that God has given about fresh air? No, she just stood up and she started preaching. And after a little bit, she stopped and paused in her sermon, and she said, you know, it seems to me like it's a little close in here. I wonder if the deacons would mind opening the windows on that side of the church. So the deacons got up and opened all the windows on that side of the church. And then she started preaching again. Pretty soon she stopped again and she said, you know, it seems to me like it's still a little close in here. I wonder if the deacons would mind opening the windows on this side of the church. So they did that. The elderly lady that told me this story said by the time Sister White sat down that morning, she had every door and every window in the church standing wide open, but she hadn't mentioned fresh air at all. Oh, she said we all got the point, but she hadn't mentioned the words fresh air at all. Well, the counsels that God gave us through Ellen White, as I just mentioned, they're balanced and they're practical. And I will close with a short story that was told, that was written out by a minister who received a letter. He was in Australia, just a young minister starting out to preach, and he received a letter from Mrs. White. And when he got the envelope with her return address on it, he thought to himself, well, what in the world have I done? Why is she writing to me? Now let's face it, most of us probably would react somewhat the same way if Ellen White were alive today and we received a letter from her. You know, the first reaction is, because we're all sinners, and God knows things in our lives that can be changed. And so this minister is thinking, what have I done? And so he didn't quite have the nerve just to open the envelope. He prayed, Lord, give me the strength to open give me the courage to open the envelope, and then the strength to do whatever God has shown her that I should be doing. So he went out in the bush, he prayed that prayer again, courage to open, strength to do, or open the envelope. And talk about practical advice. What was the advice that Ellen White had for this young minister? Preach shorter sermons. He was preaching about an hour and a half in length at the time, and he later admitted when he told the story on himself that he was thinking about increasing or lengthening his sermons to 2 hours because he might get a few more people in the congregation that way. And here came the advice: preach shorter sermons. What did this man end up doing most of his career? Well, if you look back on his life story, most of his career, he was a chaplain in several different Adventist sanitariums. If there is one thing that sick people don't like, it's what? Somebody comes and talks and talks and talks and talks and talks. What more practical advice could God have given this young minister than to learn to say what needs to be said and don't just go on and on and on? Well, as I say, I could go on and on and on telling stories, but I won't. I want to close by showing you this to you. This is an envelope. We have lots and lots of Ellen White letters, but we have very few original envelopes that have been saved. And as I just mentioned about this young minister that I was telling you about, George B. Starr was his name, if you received an envelope like that, if I received one, I remember, what would our reaction be? I remember when this was given to me many years ago, and I looked at it, and I thought, I knew a little bit about the man that received the letter, and I thought to myself, I wonder what his reaction was. And then, after thinking a little bit about that, I thought for another couple of minutes about what would I have done? What would I have done if I had gone to the mail and there, back then, here was a letter addressed to James Nix from Ellen G. White. Would I have had the nerve to open it? And as I was thinking about that, I got a little smug thought in my mind that said, well, you're never going to go to the mail and get a letter from Ellen White because she's been dead since 1915. So it's not going to happen to you. And for a split second, I felt pretty good about it until I realized they are the testimonies for what? The church. And who's the church? That's you and me. So the question I leave you with is the one that I ask myself and still ask myself: do I have the nerve to open and read these special counsels that God has given our church as we're preparing for the second coming of Christ? Amen.
And to keep the inspiring story of the White family alive as part of our liturgy today, we turn not to Mrs. White's husband, or to her son, or to her grandson, but to her nephew, Frank Belden, whose parents were Stephen and Sarah, who happened to have been Mrs. White's older sister. It is from Frank Belden, Mrs. White's nephew, that comes our closing hymn today, our hymn of consecration, Holy Thine.
we're being asked to follow the Spirit of Prophecy team to the Mandeville Seventh-day Adventist Church this afternoon at 3 o'clock for additional presentations of the Spirit of Prophecy. Let us pray. Send us now away from your courts, O Lord, refreshed, renewed with the blessings of this day. Keep the words of truth in our hearts, we pray. May we not forget them on our homeward journey. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.